It is great to be here this morning with all of you and to be able to speak on the topic of rebellion. I'm used to being called a rebel, but it's usually not a compliment. It's usually in the context of being denied a visa somewhere. So I'm really pleased to be here sort of amidst my people. Look, about 250 years ago, Thomas Jefferson said, "I hold it that a little rebellion is a good thing every now and then, and is necessary in the political world as storms in the natural." And it's interesting for me to think about that in the context of 2014. The last time I stood on this stage and spoke at PopTech was exactly 5 years ago. It was the fall of 2009. And if I were to think back, this was at the front end of what became a really great 4-year run as senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And when I reflect on the topic of rebellion and when I reflect on what I learned from Secretary Clinton, one thing really stands out to me. And that is that if there's one thing I learned in 4 years spending all that time in the White House Situation Room or sitting across the hall from Madam Secretary, it's that there's a massive shift in geopolitical power that's taking place right now. Now, most people talk about shifts in geopolitical power in geographic terms. They say, oh yes, well, power is moving from Europe and the United States east to Asia, or from the global north to the global south, right? I think that's a debatable proposition, and I'll let some other people debate it. But what I do believe is true without an ounce of doubt in my mind is that there is a significant shift in geopolitical power that's taken place over the last 5 years. And that shift in power is from traditional hierarchies, like the nation state, like large media companies. And they've seen their power fragmented and distributed through a network of citizens, networks of citizens, and small institutions. And the effect of this is that it's really given citizens capabilities to rebel in ways that weren't previously possible. It's never been easier than now to start a rebellion. But with the benefit, again, of some sort of clear-eyed hindsight, I would suggest that for those of us who have been witness to the rebellions in the United States and abroad, things haven't quite measured up to what we would have hoped for. We feel like it's a job undone. You know, calls for hope and change or the overthrow of dictatorships, it always fell short. And whether our goal was, you know, a bold program to attack climate change or more and better democracies, seems like we've lost some ground over the last 5 years. And what I want to do, I want to spend my time on the stage with you this morning to give the perspective again from the, you know, sort of the insider's perspective from the White House Situation Room and Hillary Clinton's office of 4 things that I think are necessary to move from rebellion to the hoped-for reality. Number 1, leadership and institutions are necessary. You know, I had a front row seat for a lot of rebellions, a lot of revolutions, from the Green Movement in Iran through the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain. And those movements all began leaderless. Those that developed some institutional structure and those that developed leaders succeeded. Those that didn't failed. I think that Egypt is a really good example of this. You know, if you look at the people who are actually in Tahrir Square, it was wildly diverse. It was a majority young people. And since I'm 42 years old, I define young as under 45. You know, young people from, you know, Coptic Christians to Sunni to Shia to labor to, you know, people from labor unions to this to that. And they overthrew Mubarak. They overthrew a dictator who'd been there for 30-some years. The problem is that once the dictator was overthrown, they did not organize, they did not institutionalize. Trusted leaders did not emerge from those who worked in Tahrir. Who did organize? The Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood won, they were democratically elected. And unfortunately, what the Muslim Brotherhood came to believe was that they were democratically elected to become dictators and put in place an anti-Semitic, anti-woman, anti-free speech dictatorship, which was completely untenable. So what happened? Mubarak's old generals then had a counter-revolution, and they then took over, after which they quickly ordered 529 members of the Muslim Brotherhood to be executed, and they now have 23,000 political prisoners. And so people in Egypt post-Tahrir are in worse shape than they were before Mubarak, because Mubarak would at least play at openness and not being a dictator. If you look at Libya, we've gone from having a corrupt dictator to sort of prehistoric tribes. If you look at Syria, who has done the best organizing against Assad in Syria? It's ISIS. And if you look at the historic context behind movements that have been successful, think about the transition out of communism in Poland. There were institutions like the Solidarity Movement and individuals like Lech Walesa around whom the Poles would then galvanize. If you think about South Africa and the apartheid movement, there was some institutional structure created within the ANC, and there were leaders that emerged out of it like Nelson Mandela. And so while I like the idea of movements having their origins largely leaderless, it suggests that the movements are more citizen-centered as opposed to being propelled by a cult of personality. Once you overthrow the government, you have to govern. You have to win an election. And that requires institution, it requires leaders, it requires a level of discipline that has eluded a lot of the people who have propelled the rebellions in recent years. I think you can look at it here in the United States. Let's contrast the Occupy movement on the left with the Tea Party on the right. The Occupy movement only occupied a moment. The Occupy movement only occupied a moment because it didn't have any institutional structure to hold it together or propel it forward or to develop key planks that could then manifest themselves within the engine of our governance. And it did not really allow leaders to emerge. By contrast, the Tea Party is strong, and it's very strong, and it's growing stronger. And that's because they hacked the Republican Party. The Tea Party took advantage of the very substantial and very powerful institutional structure that is the Republican Party, and they used that to mainstream the extreme. So I think what's happening in our country demonstrates the importance of institutionalization and leadership development. Thing number two, to go from rebellion to hoped-for reality. We have to get women more involved at all levels in these movements. Yeah. Economic and political. I mean, when I think about the three grand challenges for all 7.2 billion people on planet Earth, if you had to say, all right, what are the big three? I'd say, all right, economic growth, security, and climate change. To my thinking, my single best answer about what to do with two of those is we've got to get many more women in charge at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. I mean, think about this from an economic standpoint first. Goldman Sachs recently did a study, and they said, you know, if we reduce full barriers to participation by women in the economy, the intermediate to long-term effect on the American economy would be a 9% increase in GDP. The same study said that the increase in GDP in the Eurozone would be 14%. A separate study of the Asia-Pacific region said that if reforms were enacted to reduce barriers to full participation by women in the Asia-Pacific, the per capita household income would go up 14% by 2020. Now, this is what dorks like I call macroeconomically significant numbers. There is no spending program, there is no austerity program, there is no economic development program anywhere that produces those kinds of eye-popping numbers in terms of economic growth than creating more space for women. And so, you know, whether it's the right thing to do, the just thing to do, put all that aside. As a society, it's in our naked self-interests to empower women from an economic standpoint. I saw this. I was so pleased to see Malala get the Nobel Peace Prize. I was 30 miles from her when she was shot. I was in Pakistan, and there had been 2 bombings over the previous 3 days, dozens of people killed. The security situation was just awful. I mean, I had a squadron of bodyguards moving me around. Things were very dangerous. And then in the midst of all this, we hear, a teenage girl got shot in the face by the Taliban. Alec, you're here from Hillary Clinton's office, maybe you should go see her. And I decided, you know what, I'm not going to go see her, not because I don't care about what happened, but I would hate for a narrative to develop that she's somehow a tool of the West. And sure enough, I didn't go, it was the right choice, but sure enough, that narrative, that very malignant narrative does continue to develop, and developed in Pakistan. And, I left, it was on my last day in Pakistan, and I'm just like, this place is a disaster. There are bombs everywhere. The violence against women could not be nastier. They're shooting sweet little girls in the face because they want to go to school. What is the matter with this place? And I met a woman who gave me hope. And her name is Maria Umar. And she told me, she goes, I run a business of all women. Most of the women work for me in the Waziristans, in the federally administered tribal areas in northwest Pakistan, where women are really not allowed to leave home during the day without a male companion. They're largely homebound because of the culture there. And she goes, I now have 70 employees, all women, who are doing IT microtaskings for my company. That's amazing. She goes, I have clients in the UAE, I have clients in Malaysia, I have clients in the United States. I've got 70 employees, they're all women, most of them are doing it at home, and we're growing. And I'm just like, Maria, how do you get your deal flow? How do you get your business? She goes, we get it all through LinkedIn. She said, we don't have a website. She's like, I recruit my employees on Facebook, and we get our deal flow through references on LinkedIn. And I was just like, you've got to be kidding me. And then she was telling me about the force and effect of the women in the communities who had these jobs. Let's think about women in security. If you study the last 300 peace treaties that have been made, as one does, you will see that only 7% of the negotiators were women. Only 7% of the negotiators were women, despite the fact that women are natural peacemakers and community builders. And if you look at the impact of that mere 7%, the ones who were actually involved in the negotiations had this outsized impact in the negotiations in terms of the importance of it. So, maybe the most important peace treaty of the last 15, 16 years was the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. And at the time of the negotiation of the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland, there were some female negotiators, and they had these things that were sort of being called, those are the girls' provisions. And the girls' provisions turned out, related to reconciliation, integration, and victims' rights, proved to be indispensable for the durability and success of the Good Friday Accords. So when I think about states and societies that try to control the role of women, say you must walk behind your husband, you cannot drive, you cannot own a business, you cannot own land, you cannot run a business, I think that those are the states that founder, and the states and societies that don't try to control women are going to be those that succeed, and those are the ones that are going to move from rebellion to their hoped-for reality. Which takes me to my next point, my third point. The 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. The combination of fragmenting political power with communications technologies and publishing technologies that all of you have on your mobile phones means that the ability to control a political movement, a brand, the media, simply does not exist the way that it did 30 years ago. The biggest difference between Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and George Shultz as Secretary of State 30 years earlier is George Shultz really had to worry about 5 press outlets: the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, and CBS. As long as he got those 5, he controlled the media. He controlled the narrative. Impossible for Hillary Clinton. There aren't 500 media outlets she could have controlled and controlled the media. And so in a world where there is more democratic forms of communication which can grow powerful at a moment's notice, I think our leaders need a different set of traits. First, they need to remember that they only have one mouth, but they have two ears. And that you can actually learn from the dialogue that's taking place around your work. But the second thing is that you've got to occasionally understand that every now and then you're going to be criticized, and it's fine. And you've got to fight through it. I remember one time I made a big old mistake, and Secretary Clinton, she can be very mother-like. This was not one of those moments. And she looks at me, she goes, "Alec, if you aren't taking incoming fire, you're bombing the wrong targets." And there was a lot of wisdom in that. If you aren't taking incoming fire, you're bombing the wrong targets. And so I think this idea of we're going to control this, we're not going to allow for any dissent, we're not going to allow for any openness, we're going to control this, is going to lead to failures of modern movements. I think WikiLeaks largely failed because of this. I think it largely failed because Julian Assange, for all of his rhetoric around openness and transparency, was also a remarkable control freak. And because of his desire to control the media, the narrative, and other such things, he effectively broke WikiLeaks. This applies to American politicians, it applies to people who run civil society organizations. The 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. Which takes me to my fourth and final point. When I go back to my first meeting in the White House Situation Room, and everybody remembers the first time they walk into the White House Situation Room, I can remember the faces of all of the people who sat around the table. And I can now think, I know what all of them have done over the last 5 years. And some of them have done well, and some of them have not done well. I would argue that the thing that distinguished those people who did really well is that they embraced a spirit of audacity. Words like hope and change were not campaign phrases. They were operational dictates. I think some people got into positions of power, and having gotten there, they just didn't want to lose that seat. And they forgot about the change part of hope and change. And hope became, I hope I can still keep this job or get one better. And I think those people are all going to be sad, in a couple years when they leave government. I think they're going to be sad because they're going to look back and they're going to have a nice resume, but they're going to realize that they didn't really change things in a significant way. And those people who did change things in a significant way were audacious. And they were willing to get in big fights and occasionally lose them. Because the only way to win a big fight is to get into a big fight. The only way to change a big agenda is to take an agenda head on. Now, there was an American president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was shaped during his youth into the strong man that he was by woodsmen from the interior of Maine, Theodore Roosevelt. And he said something that's very inspiring to me in this regard. He said something that's very inspiring. He said, we have to stay out of the gray twilight. He said, it is far better to dare mighty deeds, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they dwell in a gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. It is far better to dare mighty deeds, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they dwell in a gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. Now listen, from the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence to the ratification of the US Constitution was 13 years, 352 days. Change doesn't come fast. But it does require our optimism. It does require us to stay bound to our earliest convictions, and it requires us to stay out of the gray twilight. Thank you all.